Hey Optimancers, Chris here. I've been looking at Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft for a few videos here to analyze and optimize the various character options within. In my last video I checked out the College of Spirits Bard. That one's a little underwhelming, but it still does have some features I thought were interesting, and I think you can still make an effective character with it if you're attached to the concept. Today I want to look at the Undead Patron for Warlocks. This one is interesting because we had the Undying Patron for Warlocks in the Sword Coast Adventures Guide, and conceptually, these look to be pretty darn close to the same thing. I mean, they even list one of the same entities as an example patron. So I'm not sure whether this is intended to be a replacement of the Undying subclass, which is fine because it's not very good, or whether it's just another way to access a similar concept, which is fine as well. Either way, I don't see selecting the Undying Patron anytime soon anyways. So, conceptually, I think this is pretty straightforward. As a Warlock, you've made a pact with a being of great power that's also either undead or somehow embodies the power of the undead. Being that the book is Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, and we're considering horror-themed options, this one is kind of a natural fit. There's liches and vampires and mummies who could be our patron, so this is definitely in the right place. Considering our concept, we can make some pretty big choices here as to whether our pact is a willing one, because the obvious thing here would be to be making some kind of evil or dark character, but I think you could also quite easily make a character beholden to an evil undead patron unwillingly, and that could be an interesting character. So let's jump into what this patron does mechanically. So like all Warlocks, we're going to get an expanded spell list. Remember, you don't automatically know these spells. They're just additional options for spells known. Overall, I would say this isn't a standout compared to other patrons. There's some decent spells here, like Phantasmal Force and maybe Blindness Deafness, since it's not concentration and will often be concentrating on something else. Phantom Steed can be a good spell if you're a ritual caster, which Warlocks aren't, unless they have the Ritual Caster feat or the Book of Ancient Secrets Invocation, so that might nudge me towards the Pact of the Tome a bit. Overall though, the list here isn't a big draw. At first level, we get Form of Dread. This ability is cool. We can transform ourselves as a bonus action to take on some aspects of our patron. Examples are given of a shadowy crown and robes of a lich patron, or being covered in arcane glyphs from maybe a mummy patron. Whatever these aspects are, they last 1 minute. When we transform, we immediately receive temporary hit points, and that's 1d10 plus our Warlock level. So there's some scaling here, but even at level 1, this is probably on average 6 or 7 temporary hit points. When you're sitting at maybe 10 hit points, that's a pretty big boost. Then, once on each of our turns when transformed, when we hit a creature with an attack roll, and this doesn't specify whether it's a ranged or melee attack, nor whether it's a spell or weapon attack, so any attack at all, as long as there was an attack roll and we hit, we can have the target make a wisdom saving throw, and on a failure, they gain the frightened condition until the end of our next turn. The frightened condition imposes disadvantage on all ability checks, all attack rolls, and prevents movement towards our character as long as we remain within line of sight. This does not require a concentration, so this is just really good. Imposing the frightened condition potentially every turn? Sign me up. Now, when I think frightened condition, I can't help but think there's some synergy here with some spells and subclass features. A frightened creature in a Conquest Paladin's aura, for example, takes damage and can't move. The one we can easily take advantage of is the Summon Shadow Spawn spell. Naturally, as an Undead Patron Warlock, we might be drawn towards Summon Undead as the obvious thematic choice, but if we use Summon Shadow Spawn instead and choose the Fury option, it's going to have advantage on all attacks against frightened creatures. The big one, in my opinion, is the Fey Wanderer Ranger. The Fey Wanderer Ranger in our party is going to get massive use out of their Beguiling Twist ability, which can create a frightened condition for a minute, and that's not a limited use ability. So an Undead Patron Warlock plus a Fey Wanderer Ranger become a pretty devastating combination. Really, a party member forcing a save versus frightened every turn is absolutely ideal for this subclass. It's almost beyond hope. So this one, it's very good, and potentially amazingly good depending on our synergy with other party members, spells, or potentially multiclassing. Because remember, we can actually get this with a single level dip in Warlock. Finally, we get the immunity to the frightened condition, not advantage on saves, just complete immunity, like we would get with the heroism spell, but without concentration, so this is also really good. And we can make this transformation a number of times equal to our proficiency bonus between long rests. So potentially every combat, at least eventually. And again, if we multiclass, this still scales. Now, there are some other really good first level Warlock features out there. Hexblade is the most famous, or perhaps infamous option. Genie Pact can come in really strong with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. This one, it's in that league. This is top notch. At level 6, we get Grave Touched. Firstly, we no longer need to eat, drink, or breathe, which is neat, but it really doesn't come up in gameplay. Not that often anyway. Secondly, once on our turn, when we hit a creature with an attack, we can replace our damage with necrotic damage. If we're using our Form of Dread feature, then we add an additional die of damage. So thematically, the change to necrotic is cool, though assuming we're making more than one attack and hopefully hitting with more than one attack, we aren't completely switching our damage, it's just one attack. The extra damage die is probably the big one here. That's an extra d10 damage per round if we're using Eldritch Blast. And that's going to be about 5 damage per round right there alone. If we're using a weapon, it could easily be a d12. That's the kind of extra damage a high-level barbarian does on a crit. We're doing it every round. Now, the d6 that you add once on your turn is pretty common with recent subclasses, and this one is basically like that, but we're getting very easily a bigger die. So that's great. So mainly from a mechanical analysis, the extra damage is what stands out here. It's a solid feature. And not overwhelming, but better than a lot of 6th level Warlock features out there. I'm looking at you, Celestial, and Hexblade packs. Then at 10th level, we get Necrotic Husk. We get resistance to necrotic damage, and if we're using our Form of Dread, we get immunity. Necrotic damage can come up a fair amount with undead and some demons, but I wouldn't say it's a common damage type to be taking, so this is still going to be pretty circumstantial. But I'm always happy to get resistance, and in some combats, the immunity really could be outstanding. I mean, some creatures, necrotic damage is all they do. Secondly, when we would be reduced to 0 hit points, we can use our reaction to drop to 1 hit point instead, and we can inflict some damage to enemies within 30 feet, probably a bit over 20 damage, and we gain a level of exhaustion. When we do this, we can't do it again for a d4 in long rests. So there's a few things here. First, dropping to 1 hit point is hardly unique. We see this with other subclass features, as well as with racial features or spell features. What is somewhat unique here is that we actually need to use our reaction, which hopefully we still have available, so that's a bit of an issue. The damage is actually not bad. I mean, 21 damage isn't a huge amount by level 10, but there's no save for half damage, no to hit roll, they just take the damage. And the area is quite large, and there's no friendly fire. So this could amount to a fair amount of damage if we have multiple enemies. The exhaustion level, it sucks. Hopefully we aren't stacking exhaustion because it's not something you want to be piling up. But even 1 level is disadvantage on all ability checks until you complete a long rest. To get rid of this before then, we need a greater restoration spell. That's a 5th level spell, and it has a costly component. I mean, you can live with disadvantage on ability checks, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but this is disadvantage on things like perception, resisting grapples, and worst of all, it's disadvantage on our initiative rolls. So, again, we can live with this, but it's still not something you necessarily want to have until your next long rest. So, necrotic resistance or immunity is okay. The exhaustion explosion using your reaction that can only be done 1d4 long rests, I'm not a fan. It's not awful, but it's not something that really excites me. That takes us to our final feature at level 14. That's called Spirit Projection. So this one allows us to create a spiritual form that projects from our body. Our spirit form has our statistics, but lacks our equipment. We can project this spirit for up to an hour, and it can fly with hover, move through solid objects, and our main body becomes unconscious while we're guiding the spirit. We need to concentrate on this for the duration as if we're concentrating on a spell. Now, our spirit form is not invulnerable. In fact, we take damage from anything we normally would, though we do get resistance to the damage if it's piercing, slashing, or bludgeoning, which is most attacks. Any damage we take in our spirit form occurs to our actual body, and vice versa. Remember, we are concentrating. So when we take that damage, we need to make concentration saves. If we lose that concentration, or the projection ends for any other reason, then we choose whether our spirit returns to our body or our body teleports to the spirit's last location. So this, it's limiting. I mean, if we're thinking this is going to be a combat platform, having our concentration in use, it is not ideal at all. And if we lose concentration, we get to choose whether to actually be gone from the combat or whether to appear and potentially prone in the spirit space, and that's not ideal either. Now the next thing is that when we cast a conjuration or necromancy spell while in the spirit form, we can ignore any component except a costly one. Once again, the concentration we're using for this interferes with what's even available to cast. Though the final point of this is whenever we deal necrotic damage, we recover hit points equal to half the damage dealt. And remember, in our form of dread, we can change damage to necrotic, so potentially a decent healing effect. Now the main limitation here, it's the concentration, and it's a big, big limitation. This would be amazing without concentration, but with it, it's okay. I'll note you can maybe do some tricks like using this to float through a wall or a floor or ceiling, or maybe multiple walls, and then you end the effect, and then you can teleport to the spirit's location. So there's some options here for some cool utility. And if we have a really good concentration save, like +9 maybe, then this becomes an okay combat platform, since we're going to have resistance to a lot of the damage, and we can regain hit points through necrotic damage we inflict, and if we have a +9 save, we shouldn't lose concentration unless we take a massive amount of damage. But those concentration saves become a pretty big wild card otherwise, and a lot of our best spells just aren't going to be available because of the concentration requirement. So this ability, I think it's pretty cool, and it's not terrible, but as I went through each of these features, that concentration, it just was always in my head about how it limited them. Resistance to damage, but you're making those saves. Spellcasting without components, but concentration's already in use. Healing damage, but we're still making saves every time we take the damage. So the final feature, I think, ends up being okay. I mean, it's not a bad ability, but it's not amazing. So to sum up, overall, I would rank this as a very strong subclass for Warlock. One of the better Warlock subclasses in my opinion. We get a fantastic first feature, a pretty good 6th level feature, an okay 10th and 14th level feature. None of the features I would say are bad. So I will say, like with some other Warlock subclasses, the 1 or 2 level dip does look pretty tempting here, and that's the Undead Patron. And that is all the subclasses from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. There's just the 2, so in our next video we're going to start looking at the lineage options available. Hope you'll join me for that. But until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody. Talk to you soon.